There's a lot of academics in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, who really denigrate the idea that the mind can access the truth. And they've come up with complex ideas that replace that notion. The pragmatist Richard Rorty, who wants to say, well, at one point, the Declaration of Independence, it was taken seriously by people at the time, and by being taken seriously, he says it did some good work. But for heaven's sakes, don't take it seriously. He even refers to it, I think, at one point as handy bits of rhetoric. What Rorty wants to say is that we are all sort of prisoners of these ever-changing vocabularies.
Concepts with Sean Buckley.
Thanks again, everyone. In this episode with Dr. Livingston, we continue to wrestle with this notion of universal values. You might recall in earlier episodes, we talked about Prime Minister Mark Carney's book, Values, and Justin Trudeau's comments about Canada now being the first post-national state because we have shared values. This really worries me. Attractive sounding political values which have the aura of absolute truth have often been used to tyrannize and oppress people. We saw this in the French Revolution, the Soviet experience, and many other places. Dr. Livingston is mostly concerned about the relativism of postmodernism and critical theory and other fads that dismiss things as mere opinion or simply handy bits of rhetoric. David makes a strong case for capital T truth. He's a professor of liberal studies and political studies at Vancouver Island University. We center our discussion around a chapter he wrote for the book titled Canadian Conservative Political Thought. In it, he lays out the tension between truth in its strongest sense versus the practical and prudential politics in Canada at its founding. Of course, David and I agree on far more than we differ, but I still tried hard to highlight this essential difference. Well, essential in my mind at least, the difference between universals or metaphysical abstractions and the real-life experience of a nation's history. Again, I think the concept of a nation and its history is the only way we can make sense of things that we think are essential, things such as stable government or private property or habeas corpus or the rule of law. If we abandon a specific and particular experience of Canada and replace it with values like Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau have done, we open ourselves up to the tyranny of whomever has the power to enforce them on us. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Thanks again for checking it out. David, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I've really enjoyed your chapter in this book called It's Canadian Conservative Political Thought, and I've discussed it with other authors, but I wanted to jump deep into your chapter, and your chapter's on D'Arcy McGee, and it's titled The Sacred Temple of Truth, Thomas D'Arcy McGee's Civic Nationalism. And your first paragraph really dives into this concept of capital T truth and the sacred capital T temple. And I'm wondering, why did you use that as a springboard to talk about Thomas D'Arcy McGee?
Yeah, I guess because there's this prevalent postmodernism, which seems to be out there. It's been out there for quite a long time. And there's a lot of academics in Canada, in the United States, in Europe, who really denigrate the idea that the mind can access the truth. And they've come up with complex ideas that replace that notion, which we can get into later. But what I found interesting about Thomas D'Arcy McGee, one of the founders of Canadian Confederation, helps to write our first constitution in 1867, is that he was so committed to this idea that there is truth, which is available for the mind to come to know. And that places him in this very long sort of philosophic tradition, stretching all the way back to Socrates and Plato and the ancient Greeks. But he wants to somehow use this notion as a way of thinking about the Constitution and what his job is as a statesman in Canada. The kind of constitution he wants to form for Canada is one which is open to the possibility of human beings grasping the truth. And I very much worry that with the postmoderns, by removing that possibility, would really undermine our constitutional order.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm glad you mentioned that he's trying to take this idea of truth and our ability to try to grasp at it and actually apply it to something particular. So that thread is going to come out as we go through your chapter. But just before we get too much into that thread, on page 69, you say that McGee was a, quote, extreme moderate, end quote, or a, quote, radical conservative, end quote. And then you also say this, quote, he was one who seeks knowledge in a manner that is respectful of traditions, end quote. What do you mean by all that?
Yeah, that's a complex series of claims there, isn't it? I think one of the first ones maybe comes from David Wilson's biography, 2-volume biography of D'Arcy McGee, which is an excellent biography, by the way. I would highly recommend it to anyone who wants to get to know McGee's biography, but also his political thought. It's very good. But this other idea of the radical conservative comes from a thinker named Eva Braun, not Hitler's mistress, but a different Eva Braun. Eva Braun, who is, I think, still a tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, and she's fabulous, a wonderful writer. And she comes up with this idea of radical conservative. And it's it sounds like an oxymoron or a paradox. But what she's suggesting with that is the radical conservative is an individual like McGee who is very interested in diving deep into philosophical questions and trying to plumb them to their depths. At the same time, he doesn't use that as a kind of skepticism that erases all sorts of boundaries that might emerge through our traditions. So if you think of someone like Edmund Burke, who's very much in favor of traditions and of the institutions that form over time, complex institutions that help to shape our society and shape who we are, McGee is very respectful of those institutions as well and where they come from. He's not interested at all in being a sort of revolutionary radical and blowing those institutions apart. Rather, he wants to find, I think, the first principles that ground those and give those institutions legitimacy. It's radical in the sense that he's willing to think long and hard about some deep truths, but at the same time, he's very respectful of these traditions that have emerged out of, for instance, the British constitutional tradition.
Yeah. And so this is unraveling this tension that you should bill me for counseling or something, because you're solving one of the big problems that I've had between this grasping at truth, sort of these universals, the true, the good, the beautiful, all these big ideas, but then also the specificity and particularity of a tradition. And that was another layer on the onion that you've been peeling off in your essay here. At the bottom of that page, you talk about how McGee actually lived in the United States for a while, and he thought there was actually greater freedom in Canada. And he thought that we shouldn't have a hyphenated nationalism. And there's a few words he says here, quote, patriotism rejects the prefix, end quote. And so it made me wonder, what do you think McGee's idea of a Canadian identity was? Not the specifics of the Canadian identity, but just the concept of an identity. Could we even have an identity if he was so wedded to universals? And so a Canadian identity is a particular thing, whereas you've opened the chapter with him being a champion of capital T truth. So again, this tension between the universal and particular. What do you think McGee would have said about that?
Yeah, that is the complex terrain I'm trying to wrestle with McGee. Whether there's a final satisfactory answer or not, I'm not sure. But I think that passage that you mentioned, he says, I don't want to see a hyphenated Canadian. I want to see French Canadian or English Canadian. I want to just see Canadian. And that does come out of his experience, having lived in the United States, and as an Irish Catholic who had immigrated to the United States, he had experienced a lot of bigotry and a lot of prejudice. This was the height of the Know Nothing Party at the time, and notoriously, or maybe just mythically, you hear these stories of signs up in the windows of shops saying, no Irish need apply. And so he found it really difficult in the United States at that time with his family. He was trying to get a newspaper started. He was trying to build schools. He was trying to do these different things. He gets lured over to Montreal for a visit, and there's a number of people there who are trying to encourage him to bring his family to Canada. And he has a look around and he says, wow, Canada's actually doing things right, and I feel much more welcome here with my family than I feel in the United States. Of course, there's a big Catholic community in Montreal. There's both Irish and there's French Catholics. So he feels much more at home there. And then he starts to see that the British constitutional principles that underline the Canadian political order at the time are working really well and give people a great deal of freedom. And he begins to think maybe Canada's onto something and that the Americans have kind of lost their way somewhat. So he begins to drift in that orbit. And so he's beginning to see that there's something, again, as you said, particular about Canada. There's something that is emerging. So there, I think we start to see his way of thinking through some of these fundamental principles that are emerging through the constitutional growth of the British Constitution, and kind of grafted onto the Canadian scene and made particular to this place. And so he's trying to wrestle with those two ideas, the particular and the universal, coming together in an actual community that he feels at home in, much more at home than in the United States.
Yeah, love it. Love it. So on the next page, just continuing on this theme of America for just a little bit, on page 72, you talk about, and 71, you talk about the issue with slavery in the United States and how he was, no fan of that. And you say here on the top of page 72 that, quote, though Canada might lag the United States in material progress, and then you quote him, we possess some social advantages which they perhaps do not. And then he goes on to describe how we haven't dealt with slavery. And you bring the distinction between material capital and social capital right into McGee's thinking at the start of Canada. And I wonder if you could expand on that, the material and the social capital and the tension there.
Yeah. Well, certainly one of the biggest event that was happening at the time that Canada was thinking about becoming a united British colony. And McGee was very early in thinking about that as a project and was writing about it in the newspaper that he started when he came to Canada. The newspaper is called The New Era. The big event is the American Civil War. So America is falling apart. It begins to look like perhaps that whole American experiment was a failure from the start. People are trying to think through what has caused this, what's the problem. McGee weighs in on that, and he's very adamant that again, going back to first principles, he reads the Declaration of Independence. He finds much in that document to praise and to cherish. So the idea that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. He switches that word to privileges. Interestingly enough, he takes the word rights out and puts privileges in there, which we could talk about. But he says that this is the free man's creed. This one stellar sentence in that document really is the foundation for freedom. And that's what America at its best stands for. So again, that seems to put him in that kind of natural rights tradition of John Locke and Paine and a bunch of others. But then he wants to embed that again into the Constitution of Great Britain. He says, where does this come from ultimately? What are the roots of this? It's the constitutional tradition going all the way back to Magna Carta. So he wants to bring those two together again and then come back to Canada and say, well, we have an advantage here. For one thing, we've never had slavery in the same way that the United States has had slavery. We can hang on to that tradition of freedom that they started with, and which is part of our tradition too, insofar as we still remain connected to that British constitutionalism. And so that's where I think, as you said, sort of the social capital, he seems to argue that Canada is starting off in a very good way by having that social capital to build from. Now, he would love for us as well to become a wealthy, prosperous nation, but the focus here is, well, my goodness, we might not be as rich as the Americans, but boy, we're much better than they are because they're falling apart over this question of slavery, whereas we don't have that issue to deal with here.
Yeah, brilliant. You've jumped ahead to the end of your chapter when you start talking about inalienable rights. So that's where I want to end up for sure. And so
Sure. Okay.
I'm just going to put a pin in that topic because that is a juicy one for sure. But before we get there, you talk for a couple pages here about his thoughts on democracy. And on page 73, you say this, quote, McGee also advocated for a mixed regime. He worried that pure democracy tended towards homogenization and a lowering of standards. It tended to prize equality at the expense of excellence, end quote. And then you also say, you mentioned mixed constitution again, and then you quote him at length. I won't read the whole thing, but this is McGee talking here now. He says, quote, no unmixed form of government can satisfy the wants of a free and intelligent people. That unmixed democracy, for instance, must result in anarchy or military despotism, end quote. And then at the bottom of the page, actually, I'll leave that for the next. He's talking about Tocqueville. So I wonder what your thoughts are, how you understand McGee's thinking around democracy, because it seems like preference for democracy fits best with universalism, right? We're all free and we're all equal and we're all citizens of the global economy and globalism and cosmopolitanism, whatever word you choose to put with it. And yet here he is now tying back in these weird ideas of a mixed regime. And so what were your thoughts around McGee's thinking on that?
Yeah, in another essay that I published earlier in 2015 on McGee, I maybe explore that a little bit in a little bit more detail. And in that essay, what I point to is McGee is not arguing for a mixed regime in the sense that there would be some kind of landed aristocracy, as there was in feudal Europe or feudal England. And that was the base of their power, and they became another order within the constitutional structure, and then there was the lower orders and so forth. That's not what he's looking for. And in fact, he says that would be impossible in Canada. But the problem in Canada is not that we're going to have an overbearing landed aristocracy. That's not going to be our problem. The problem is we have too much liberty, surprisingly, because it's just the wide open country and lots of entrepreneurialism and immigrants coming in and starting businesses or farms or whatever. And so how are we going to control that in a way that is productive? Because he speaks about well-ordered liberty. He wants well-regulated, well-ordered liberty. And so he's trying to think again through what are the forms and what are the institutions Canada is going to have to build kind of from scratch in a way, in order that we can remain free, but it's not going to go off the rails. We're not going to end up in some kind of Hobbesian war of all against all, sort of a state of nature kind of situation where that would be, in his view, the worst case scenario of unregulated liberty, where we're just competing with each other in the worst possible way. So he's looking for that fine balance between these two.
Yeah.
Now, what does he mean then by aristocracy if he doesn't mean that landed aristocracy? He actually goes back to Aristotle's definition of aristocracy that emerges in Aristotle's work, The Politics. And there, aristocracy just means aristos, which is the Greek word for the best, and the arche, the last part of that, aristocracy, means the rule of the best in the interests of the common good. So the rule for Aristotle would be the rule of the few virtuous and wise for the common good. Now, that's perhaps too much to hope for, and it's probably very stale in the moment we're in right now in terms of populism. Nobody likes experts telling us what to do. McGee did think that one thing we would want to do is make sure that we had an education system that was really pointing towards educating people to become intelligent, wise, thinking of the common good, hardworking. It was going to be a meritocracy, ultimately, is what he was getting at. Not meritocracy, I would say, in the sense where it's criticized now. I think what's criticized now as meritocracy is really just credentialism, where people are just pursuing credentials. Wealthy people are trying to get their kids into Harvard with whatever means possible to get that credential. Are the kids that are going to Harvard getting an education? That's highly debatable these days, isn't it? They're getting a credential, and then that puts them into some kind of social hierarchy. And if that's what you want to call meritocracy, then I don't think McGee would have been in favor of that at all. I think what he's interested in is real, genuine education, which is going to propel some people to take their place and work towards the common good. And who wouldn't want that, really? Yeah. Ultimately, I mean, when we think about elections, for instance, what are elections? Elections are supposed to be the citizens not rolling a dice or just choosing by lottery. We're supposed to be making a selection among candidates as to who is the best. And by best, we mean who do we think is really going to work hard and maybe has the background and the education, the experience, the knowledge to do what's right for the common good for the rest of us. So as much as we're supposedly a democracy, the very fact that we have elections signals to us that we're actually still Aristotelian. We still have a little bit of that aristocracy idea. Choose the best candidate. Don't just choose randomly, the best person. So I think, again, that's what he's doing. He's such an interesting character because he's trying to weave these things together that seem like contradiction. He's trying to find a way in which they can be harmonized.
Yeah. You mentioned that we don't have to learn liberty. In the quote you say here, in our new world, one plant, liberty, is indigenous and grows wild all around us, and the other, stability, must be introduced from afar and carefully cultivated. And you talk about McGee apparently did not assume compatibility between a democracy and philosophy, end quote. And you talk about an aristocracy based on learning and talent. And we need to, quote, keep the regime friendly to philosophy, end quote. And I kind of smiled when I read that. A typical philosophy professor would put that in there. No, I'm just kidding. I know what you mean. And then you also say in this paragraph here that some people either deliberately, quote, either deliberately or inadvertently deny the very possibility of philosophy, end quote. So I wondered, you've studied Canadian history an awful lot, and often as Canadians, we pride ourselves in our anti-intellectualism. I think even de Tocqueville, in the beginning of his second book, he says, Americans are so proud of being, they practically apply Descartes to the extent they have not read him, and so it's all about us. I think, therefore I am. I'm going to go and do it and live my life. And yet you're saying that, hang on a second, actually McGee actually thought it was, like you said, he read Burke and he read Tocqueville. And so is he just a weirdo in Canadian history, or is he maybe offering a different Canadianism that we tend not to hear enough about?
Yeah, it might be the latter, and I wish that wasn't the case, that he was the outlier. I did my PhD in the United States. I'm originally from Canada, born and raised in Alberta, in Edmonton, excuse me. And so I went down to the University of Dallas to do my PhD, and that's where I came across the American founders. I really knew nothing about the American founders. I went down to the University of Dallas to study political philosophy. It was a very good school for that.
Mm-hmm.
But as so often happens, you go to a place and you get so much more than you thought you were going to get. And I got the American founding, and I was so impressed with the writings of Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
Made me think, in all the years, because I'd done a master's degree already at the University of Alberta with a brilliant scholar, Leon Craig. But in all my years in political science up at the University of Alberta, I hadn't learned very much about the American founding, but I hadn't learned very much about the Canadian founding either. And so I started to think, what was happening in Canada? Who was thinking about first principles? I had kind of acquired that view, I think, from Peter Russell and others, that there are no first principles in Canada. Don't bother looking for them. We've looked, they're not there, right? But I started to come across the work of Janet Asienstadt and William Gardner and Ian Gentles, all people that you know. And they had just started to put out that Canadian original documents book, because their argument was, no, there are first principles. So that's what started me thinking about Thomas D'Arcy McGee and looking particularly in that direction. And I was really impressed with the level of thought of McGee. And again, his openness to philosophy, his depth of reading. He was traveling around giving lectures on Shakespeare, for instance. Shakespeare is a political thinker, to packed houses, to packed audiences. And one of his projects was, if we're going to form a country, as he hoped we would get the British North America Act, we would form one sovereign nation. We need an education that's going to go along with that. And he began to think an awful lot about that. He began to actually write a lot of poetry, surprisingly, which he hoped would come into the school system and form the imagination of young Canadians, an imagination that then would be fit to purpose. It would be the sort of ideas and love for this particular sovereign country that he was helping to form, and its connection to the constitutional principles. So maybe I've wandered too far away from your original question, but I think he's trying to, again, knit all of this stuff together and say, if we're going to make this work, we have to have a population which is educated so that they can sustain liberty. It's not an easy thing. To be self-governing, the individual citizens themselves have to be capable of governing themselves. In their day-to-day life, they have to be rational. They have to be able to control their appetites. They need to be concerned with the common good. They have to be able to put aside their self-interest sometimes for the interests of others. All of those sorts of things, that takes a fair amount of moral character building. And he could see that that was going to be essential if we were going to sustain this project. So he's interested in liberty, but he's also interested, he's still got one toe in the waters of the ancient classical political philosophers and all of their writings about moral virtue and character formation as the necessary groundwork to sustain a free society. So it's sort of almost like a classical republicanism, if that's a familiar term from people like Leo Strauss who are plumbing that.
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned Strauss, and the fact that McGee wrote poetry opens us up into this, where the conversation I was hoping it would go as well. So when you say that someone who's a thinker is also writing poetry, I get excited and I'm like, okay, there's hope for this guy. Not for you, but for McGee. There's hope for you too, of course. But I fear that one of, at least in my background, science and technology, everything's a definition, right? It's all episteme or episteme, I pronounce it wrong, the book knowledge, science knowledge, as Aristotle would say. And yet, certainly in medicine, we are using applied or practical knowledge where the issues are contingent and you have to actually use what you know, but also maybe make a decision based on prudential choice. So in politics, it seems to be, to me, more about prudence and applying wisdom and knowledge as opposed to taking techne or technological solutions or scientific solutions. And so I mention all of that to get into this next issue. On the bottom of page 74, you talk about how he said, McGee was saying we need to be amalgamated into a common effort and people should be judged on how they contribute to the common stock, and that, quote, feuds arising from exaggerated feelings of religion and nationality, end quote, should be avoided. And then you mention Leo Strauss. Actually, you don't mention Strauss. That's me writing Strauss in the margin. But you say, quote, if historicism and postmodernism, by contrast, assert that we cannot liberate ourselves from our worldview, our culture, then, to repeat, McGee is opposed to historicism, end quote. And the next line you say, Aristotle argues that truth transcends the political. And so I'm just hearing Strauss, Strauss, Strauss. And for a long time, I was really excited about Strauss. I thought, oh, finally, someone who gives me something solid as opposed to all this postmodern mush. However, then I've read Grant Haver's stuff, right? I don't know if you've read his book, Critiquing Leo Strauss. And he says, hang on a second. So these truths, you have to be careful. Strauss maybe is risking what Edmund Burke warned us about the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction. And so we again get to this tension that you've brought out through the whole essay between capital T truth and yet applied truths that emerge over hundreds and hundreds of years of trial and error and experimentation. And we eventually say, well, this seems to be a good way to have this unwritten constitution thing that we've used in Britain. So I'm wondering if we are creating too much of a false dichotomy. We say there's historicism and postmodernism. So you're a radical relativist, Oprah Winfrey, you tell your truth or whatever, you say your truth, versus no, we need this rigid, abstract, metaphysical universals. Isn't there a spot somewhere in the middle where we actually can say, well, we're actually trying to just simply champion this Anglo experiment of constitutional democracy? So I've given you the answer I want you to give, but feel free to disagree with it. What thoughts come to mind with all that?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot in that. So let's see. You might have to keep me on track too, because I might get lost here in the answer. But the first part, I think you had acknowledged or had quoted the section where McGee was saying again, he's already ahead of the game on that idea of diaspora politics that we're still dealing with today. So we have groups that might be coming over here, immigrating, and in a way they want to fight the battles of the country and the factions that they left behind when they came to Canada. They're still fighting those battles on our streets here. And we could name some groups, but I won't right now. And McGee in his time was dealing with the same sorts of things. There's the Catholics fighting against the Orangemen, and There's all kinds of factional battles going on, different religious sects and everything else. And he thought, we got to set that to the side. And one thing we could do is we could turn our attention to the things we have in common. And one thing we should have in common is a political order that we're trying to establish here, which has some political principles to it. And in order to do that, however, you have to let go somewhat of your particular identity, your particular ethnic or cultural or religious identity. You have to be willing to transcend that and meet on this plane where we have something in common. Right? So that's one thing that he wants to put in front of us. What that demands, though, is we also set aside what I think is that postmodern view these days, which says that you simply cannot transcend your ethnic origin. That's the root of everything about you. That's the essence of who you are. That is where your truth comes from. And there is no such thing as a common truth. There is no meeting point for us. So he wants to reject that. And that's where I think his emphasis on the truth is so important. He wants to identify something that we can all come together on. We could find a common good for our nation. So that's the first part of it. The second part, again, I think in terms of Strauss, this is where it gets tricky again with McGee, because I don't see him as saying that we have to somehow settle all the metaphysical debates and then make some kind of dogmatic claims that shut out all kinds of other inquiry or philosophy or thinking. Instead, as I started at the beginning of that essay with, it's the nation will be judged based on its openness to these transcendent truths. Not that it comes forward and claims it knows them all and it's going to impose them on everybody. It's rather, we need a form of constitution which secures that natural right human beings have to pursue the truth. And what that truth is going to reveal, what those explorations are going to look like, maybe that remains somewhat of an open question. But the fact that human beings should be free to pursue the truth, that is true. Mm-hmm. That's a fundamental truth, which I think sits at the heart of McGee's project. So that's what he really wants to secure. And that's what I think postmodernism wished to take away. There is no truth. Don't bother. All we are is just in our little factional groups. And now what do? We just fight over scarce resources or power or whatever other thing they want to fight over, but they throw out the possibility of us having something in common, namely that pursuit of the truth. So I'll just end this way. I think the way Strauss reads Socrates, and I know Strauss is complex, so this might be a simplistic view. Grant Haver's far deeper into Strauss's scholarship than I am. But the way Strauss reads Socrates is that Socrates is neither a complete relativist or skeptic, nor is Socrates a dogmatist. Socrates comes forward and says, I recognize that I'm not wise. Only a God can be wise. But I love wisdom. That's what philosophy is, the love of wisdom. And you love that thing which you lack. So he says, I lack wisdom. I know that wisdom is a good thing, and I'm going to spend my life pursuing it because that's the one thing that's worth having. I think that's where McGee is. If we could have a regime that remains friendly to that pursuit of knowledge and wisdom, we will be much better off.
Beautiful answer. And when you were saying about the postmodernists, and the thought came to mind that they actually are presenting their own version of an absolute truth. And I think you even say that in the text that, well, historicism is relativist as well, so why should I believe your comment about postmodernism or historicism? I guess the reason this is a practical concern for me, and we mentioned some of the tensions that are going on in Canada right now, we don't have to even talk about them. We could talk about the Irish tensions in the mid-19th century, right? The 1850s or 40s or whatever. So there's always been tensions. There always will be tensions. And I mentioned at the recent Civitas conference, actually, I was introducing a session on post-nationalism, and I'm not allowed to say who said what, and so I'm staying within our Chatham House rule, but I was the one giving these remarks, so I can certainly say this. I was challenging the audience. I was saying, you can't go to a Civitas conference without hearing someone say, well, peace, order, and good government, that's what we're all about, right? Those are our universal values. And I said, well, that's really just the flip side of the coin of DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever is the flavor of the day, whatever is the universal truth of the day, to be provocative about it. And so I was pushing the audience to say, we're not actually saying abstract, metaphysical abstractions when we say peace. No, we're saying a particular kind of peace that has been played out over at least 800 years in the Anglo tradition. You may want to even go all the way back to Jesus Christ and Christianity and build it out from there. And that's why an educated person used to have to know Latin and Greek to be able to read these texts in the original to truly understand the meaning of words in the English language when we're talking about these concepts. And so I guess I've moved away. I used to love Strauss a lot. I still huge respect for him. And I love the fact that he reawakened a passion for ancient political philosophy. However, I feel like he's leapfrogged over a couple thousand years of history. He really doesn't want to talk about Christianity or anything to do with that. He's not super excited about the Anglo tradition. He wants to rescue liberal democracy by reaching back to the Greeks, and I appreciate that. I get where he's going. But it almost seems like an overreaction to the postmoderns saying, oh, it's just all relative. You just like your particular... In fact, they often say it's racist, right? It's just racist and ethnocentrist. But I say, no, that's not the experience of the Anglo tradition. They stole the best ideas from every culture around the world and said, come on to our country, build the country. And so it was very much an embrace of history, the good and the bad. And through that filter of history, they would filter out, okay, no, that's a bad idea. Yeah, we've seen where that goes. And they used the history as a tool, not as a fetish where you just worship history and old things, but you use it as a practical tool to help guide you in everyday life. So I see that as falling in between universalism and saying this is just the principle and we're going to strive in a philosophical way, which I love, to find these capital T truths. But it's also not the postmodern relativism. It's a very much a situated historical experiment, historical empiricism, if you want. And we invite people into it. We say, look, for some reason, this weird thing called the British tradition has worked out, and we invite you to be part of it. Is that a terrible way to think of things, or is that a way that McGee would think? So what are your thoughts on that? It falls between those two extremes that I think you've brought out in your essay.
Yeah, I definitely think McGee is going to be friendly to that because he said in one speech, I have 3 touchstones or fundamental sources I go back to in my thinking: Burke, Burke, and Burke. So he really praised Burke and really liked Burke. But on the other hand, I think maybe where this tension is again in McGee and whether this can be worked out in some consistent way, maybe I'm struggling again, as I said earlier, to find out. The kind of historical empiricism that you're referring to can start to sound, in my view, very similar to the pragmatist Richard Rorty, who wants to say, well, at one point, the Declaration of Independence, it was taken seriously by people at the time, and by being taken seriously, he says it did some good work. It was this practical thing that sort of cleared some brush so something else could arise, right? For heaven's sakes, don't take it seriously. It was just, he even refers to it, I think, at one point as handy bits of rhetoric. Just sort of like a marketing slogan. A lot of people bought into it. It did some work for a little while, cleared some space, and that made way for something else. But also what Rorty wants to say is that we are all sort of prisoners of these ever-changing vocabularies. And so as we go about in the world, we think about it, but we're thinking about it in terms of what our vocabulary of the day teaches us to think about the world, but it's a very unstable foundation, and that's going to change. The vocabulary is going to change. We're going to think differently in the future. So that's fine, right? Mm-hmm. What I think that risks, though, is any sense that there is something that's really essential to human nature that begs for attention in our political order, lest we end up with something that's more of a dystopia than a utopia. What are some of the basic fundamental things about human beings that we should keep in mind as we're thinking of our constitutional order, and not forget those, or not just say, oh, well, that's just part of your vocabulary today, but we can let that go. You could say, well, my goodness, wouldn't that mean that Abraham Lincoln, who was fighting against slavery and said it was a great moral evil, you would say, well, that was a handy bit of rhetoric, but like, by golly, don't believe that as some truth, that holds you now. Well, what are you saying? That we could evolve our vocabulary and start to say, well, actually, slavery might actually has a ring of, kind of practicality to it. Why don't we go back to that for a little while? That's our new vocabulary.
Yeah.
There, I think McGee's going to draw a line. He's going to say, no, there's just some things that are just wrong.
Yeah.
And if we want to call that a metaphysical truth, so be it. I'll die on that hill, McGee might say. I'm going to form my constitution around a few things which are not abstract. Maybe that's the other thing. They're not things like Platonic ideas that are floating up in the sky. I think what he wants to be is maybe more Aristotelian and say, these are things about ourselves that we have discovered over time, that it is better to be given the freedom to think and the space to do that, because that's part of our nature. And it's better to think both practical thoughts, as you were speaking about earlier, the application, prudential application of how to solve particular problems, be they technical problems or health problems or whatever. But again, staying within that classical tradition, Aristotle says there's even a higher intellectual virtue, which is the pursuit of wisdom, Sophia, and prudence needs to come in underneath that. And if you lose Sophia, wisdom, then prudence now seems to be like a ship without a rudder. Sure, you're solving all kinds of problems, but you might lose track of what it's all for. What is the ultimate purpose of all this problem solving? What is the purpose of life? These big questions, which we kind of laugh about. We tell our students in my program here, this is what we do in liberal studies. We get you guys to think about the purpose of life. And they're just like, oh, that just sounds so wishy-washy. But when they get into the works and the books that we present to them, they go, this is actually the thing I need. Because our society doesn't seem to offer that in very many other venues anymore, where the students can actually think those big questions. That's what I mean by being open to philosophy and transcendence. They come back into their practical day-to-day life, I think, a little bit more grounded, a little bit more aware of the possibilities. They haven't answered the questions, but they've got a better sense of what are the important questions a human being should be asking. And how might those big questions guide some of the practical things we have to think about? Which questions deserve more attention than other ones, for instance, as we go through our life together?
Yeah.
I don't know if that made much sense in response to your question.
I love it. No, and there's a bunch of jumping off points too. I'm just trying to figure out which is the shiniest object to chase. But no, let me
just
go ahead. Yeah.
Because I mentioned my liberal studies program, which I love dearly. It's a great books program. It's probably one of the last ones in Canada, and we're at the point now where my university wants to get rid of it. They're thinking of suspending the program, justified in part by budget difficulties, sure, but one wonders too whether the budget is being used as a means to get rid of something that they either don't understand or are indifferent to or hostile to. There's not many programs like this left in Canada. Probably count on one hand the ones that are still available. I think that would bother McGee again in terms of his idea of we need an education in the deep ideas and the tradition of ideas so that the citizens who are coming forward can be thinking about all of that. What you just mentioned earlier in the conversation, this idea that there's a constitutional tradition that goes back to Magna Carta and beyond. Sean, very large majority of the students who are coming into university now that I meet have no awareness, no clue of that tradition, that it even exists, let alone any of the details of it. I think McGee would be very concerned about that these are not citizens who are necessarily well prepared to shoulder the burdens of responsible citizenship. And I'll just go in a tangent just for a second, because right now, one of the current things in the news cycle is whether or not our current Prime Minister, Carney, has done something a bit devious by not tabling a budget and not putting that before our elected House of Commons. That's a convention of responsible government. It's a convention that emerges out of the rebellions in Canada from 1837 to 1838. It's embedded in the Act of Union of 1840. It reemerges in the 1867 Act. But it's a convention. And by convention, what this means is this is the proper way to do things. If you're going to spend the people's money, You must bring it to the House of Commons where the elected representatives represent the people, can look at it and vote it up or down. And this has been happening far too much over the last 10 or 11 years. Governments are no longer following the conventions of responsible government. Well, who enforces those conventions? The people do. The people will only enforce those conventions of free and responsible government if they know the conventions, if they get really upset when they see them broken. And what I'm very concerned about, Sean, over the last 10 years is we've seen repeatedly these conventions of our system of government being just cast aside and broken, and the people basically saying nothing. Why? Because I don't think they know them. So I would come back to McGee's, and I think, again, this unites in a way. These big ideas have to live in the concrete, particular brains of the citizens here and now, and it's also rooted in our tradition. Responsible government is ours, not American, in order for those to be defended and acted upon. Otherwise, we'll lose. So I think that's maybe where the abstract truth and the particular come together in this constitutional order, this Canadian constitutional order, which makes it different from others.
Brilliant. No, I'm glad you expanded on that. And huge shout out to your program too. I agree. I'm guilty of that. I didn't learn any of this in school, right? It took many decades after graduation of reading and trying to figure it out. But again, you bring in tension, I think, two really, really important threads. On the one, it's the pre-Enlightenment metaphysical questions. Who am I? What does it mean to be a human? How did I get here? How should I live? What does it mean to have a life well lived? What's the point of it all? What comes after this game is up? So those big metaphysical questions, and I think they are popular, especially with young people throughout time. I think it speaks to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, right, of talking about myth and spirit and how should you live with your life. And people are hungry for that. And then you've also touched on convention. And what came to mind when you were mentioning Richard Rorty and his nominalism, he's saying, those are just bits of, I don't know what the term was he used, what's the word you said?
Handy bits of rhetoric?
Yeah, I like that. I got to write that down. Handy bits of rhetoric. Just so frustrating to hear that. Handy bits of rhetoric. So I guess in response to him calling the Declaration of Independence a handy bit of rhetoric or the Constitution of the United States, I would say, okay, I grant you that fact. You can have it. Let's call it a handy bit of rhetoric. Now what do we have left? And I would argue what we have left is we have the unwritten Constitution, the British common law, 900 years of convention, to use your words. And that's why I'm a much bigger fan or a booster of the unwritten Constitution approach, where we're looking back through 800 years again to understand what does the word peace mean in today's Canadian context, or order. How do we define good government? You gave a beautiful example with not tabling the budget. And so these are all understood within, the convention is understood within the particularity and specificity of a historical approach, which when I read Strauss, that seems to give him hives. He said, no, we can't do that because Rorty might come along and say that was just a handy bit of rhetoric. So I think we can push back on the Rortys of the world without flipping to the other extreme of saying, no, we're just going to hang on to abstract metaphysical truths. And even if Foucault says, well, you're just pushing your own power position on us. And again, okay, we'll take his argument to extreme and say, okay, if that is the case, then yeah, you're right. I am being Anglo-centric, and I welcome you into this tradition. Anyone in the world can come. Welcome all your immigrants and all your weary and oppressed, and come and be part of this wonderful political experience and social experience. So it's not in a closed way, but it is in a particular way. Now, is that allowable within McGee's sense of things, or would McGee say, yeah, no, you're throwing out capital T truth just to save your unwritten Constitution?
Yeah, I think he might say, what is the common law with its slow development as the judge works through a particular case ultimately trying to achieve, or what is it doing? And So we might say, and I don't really have an answer to this, but I'm just going to pose, again, maybe a false dichotomy. But on the one hand, we might say the judges are just making law from the bench. They're just making it up. We need a solution. We need a practical solution. And it seems to work in this situation. So that's the judgment. But then it gets enshrined through stare decisis and the other mechanisms of common law. So we build upon that precedent, and we build and build and build. Is that just a big social construction experiment? There's really nothing else there. It's held to be legitimate because that's how we've always done things, but it's neither better or worse than another system by which you might fumble your way towards getting some kind of social peace and some order. Or do we think that the common law works because the judges are supposed to be discovering something? They're not just making things up, but they're slowly beginning to see something emerge, which was very difficult to see, but through cases and thinking and reasoning and rejecting some arguments and accepting other ones, they're really working the way towards trying to discover the best way of ordering society. If it's the latter one, they're discovering something, then we're back to the claim that there's something true. It's very, very hard to know what that is. And we should never rest content that we've wrestled it to the ground. We might be wrong. And so the beauty, I think, of our system as well is that we have all these mechanisms by which to self-correct. Say, well, this is the way it seems to me so far, and here's my reasons. I owe you my reasons, as if there's some rational basis for my thinking, which you could share if I could convince you, because you're a rational being and I should be open to that. Rather than using violence, we use speech and logos, which is, again, Aristotle's way of describing politics. And I hope to be able to persuade you, but maybe you'll find the holes in my argument and I'll be more persuaded by you. Again, suggests that we're working together towards a common truth, not making it up, not just socially constructing our way into the future. So I think that's where McGee, again, would come back to, no, we're trying to find something. I think he would also come back to human nature again as kind of the touchstone. Does this work for human beings? This thing we're developing, does it help us, to borrow Aristotle's language again, does it help us to flourish? Are we in a better, could I make the argument that you just made? Come join us and you can be a part of our society. Could I add to that? Because I think you'll like it here because it's really good. Can I still make that argument? Or am I stuck just saying, well, it's ours. Right. It's not yours, but we like it. Come over, maybe you'd like it too, but I can't tell you that it's better or worse in some really deep way. Yeah.
No, that's beautiful. And I agree entirely with you, of course. And I often think of we're trying to discover or apply, grasp a hold of universal truths, I would say as revealed or as discovered or experimented with in history. So it's this, we often use the example of the rule of law versus legal instrumentalism. It's very, very difficult to put our sense of what the law should be into words, because as soon as you start putting them down onto paper, it's, oh man, I think we're missing the whole gist of it. But yet everybody knows, yes, you should stop your car when a mother duck and her ducklings are crossing the road in the spring. There's no law for it written down, but everybody just knows, yeah, that's the right thing to do, at least in Canada. And I worry that we become too sheepish about claims of, oh, you're just being ethnocentric or xenophobic or racist. That's always the opposite extreme. Either you're a relativist or you're a racist. And then we say, oh no, I'm a universalist. I'm just a Platonist or I'm an Aristotelian. At some point we have to say, actually, Plato and Aristotle are also part of this grand Western tradition for all its warts and failures and strong points and weak points. And so at some point we're saying, and this applies even to Christianity, right? I say this to my parents who say, no, love is love, and that's no matter what. Okay, but how do you understand love? What kind of love are you talking about? Is it agape, phileo, storgio, all the different words to describe the kind of love, enemy love, self-sacrificial love. And so all the words we use, even the dialogue we're having now, is based upon a language that's emerged over several thousands of years. Not to say that that language is entirely relative. You can come up with a new word, maybe it'll be adopted, but there's a good chance it won't be adopted. And so we're still submitting to language, grammar, syntax of this thing that it works, and I think it's a good thing. It's okay to say, yeah, the English language is a good thing. And so is that too wishy-washy to say, I want to grasp the whole of the Western tradition and be an unqualified defender of it, and to say that that doesn't make me a relativist, to say that that's my position.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, back to McGee, I think what I found quite interesting about him is he was an Irish nationalist in his youth, and he participated in a rebellion trying to overthrow British rule of Ireland. And it was a failed rebellion, and a number of his compatriots were found and tried, and then they were going to be hanged for the crime. He managed to escape. Many of those sentences were commuted, and some of the individuals were sent into exile, and so on and so forth. So he originally had rejected British constitutionalism entirely. Root and branch, just thought it was the most wicked thing. Then he comes to the United States, then he immigrates to Canada, and he goes, I have to have a second thought about this British constitutionalism. When it is adopted in Canada and it becomes a Canadian thing, it works pretty good. It works well. And so he begins to see that I can isolate the principles that are emerging out of that tradition. And I can appreciate the principles for their intrinsic value or their truth, quite apart from having, therefore, to necessarily say it's right because it's British. That's where, when he was a youth in Ireland, there's no way to do that. He would just, the British are our oppressors, and therefore anything that's British is terrible, which is kind of the way a lot of young people think today, right? He's just associated with that tradition or something, or those people or something. And no, he says, look, the fact that this is a good constitutional order is a claim I can make independently from the fact that it happens to be British. It just happens to be British, and that's pretty cool too. This is a good political order, which I could defend on other grounds, other reasons. Now, that might, in your view, sever too much kind of the truth from that tradition, right?
Yeah. That gives us Mark Carney, right? He writes this thick book on values, and then he's just going to hammer his values on us. And so I see this, the history of being our only defense against people who write books like this, get elected, and then start to inflict their abstract truths on us.
Right, yeah. Well, so again, there's what is the constitutional tradition that he wants to hang on to in Canada? And it's going to include things like responsible government. It's going to include these various things. So then we get very particular, we get very concrete. Yeah. And we have to, as Canadians, defend those principles, or we will be simply subject to Carney and his dictates from on high, you know? If you're not going to pass a budget through the House of Commons, this is a fundamental violation of one of the most important principles of our system of government, over which people had rebellions and people died in 1837, 1838 to establish exactly that principle. You know, never take this away from us ever again, and insisted upon it. And the constitutional changes flowed from that. Yeah. And now we seem to be having it happening, and people are just, oh, well, it doesn't matter to me. Yeah. So maybe I come back around to your point. We need to know these traditions if we're going to in accordance with them. I just think that McGee says that there are some traditions that are more worthwhile than other ones. And it's not simply because they're British. That would just, for him, be too parochial or something. It would just be like, well, it's good because it's British. I'm not minimizing your viewpoint by trying to say that, but I'm just saying you would want something more than, yes, it's British, and that's part of the reason why it's good. What's also unique about the British is that they came up with a system that allowed them to fumble towards something that is intrinsically good. That's what he wants to put the priority on. The intrinsic goodness of what emerged from that tradition.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, no, and you can probably see I've struggled to try to find something to disagree with you on. So it was fun to try to pull that out. And I was going to close just with the thought that in all of this, we're having this discussion by discussing a historical person, and by making your call, like you said, to really embrace liberal studies and learning about these ideas. So the way to learn about the pursuit of capital T truth within a political setting is by studying the particularities and specificities of the history. And so again, you have that tension right there together, if I've captured that property. You're nodding, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm very concerned about what is happening with higher education in Canada these days. There's a lot of distress in the universities, and they've fallen on hard times, partly, I think, through the decisions that the senior administration made over the years, which were not good decisions. But I think overall, my sense is that higher education also has lost sense of what its real purpose is. I don't denigrate at all the idea that universities are a place where young people come and they learn how to get employment skills and knowledge to enter into the workforce. I think that's fine. That's always going to be part of university. But where I think university leadership has fallen down is that they no longer say, yet there's also a higher calling. There's also something else universities absolutely must do for our society, and that is to allow young people access to the tradition, deep knowledge of that whole tradition, and other people's traditions as well. It's not just the Western that possibly could shine a light on some truth for us that we desperately need, but that this is really fundamental for a free society, that we have these places here where people can think, where they can explore the tradition, where they can wrestle with those great texts and those ideas and see what past thinkers had said about some of the problems we're dealing with now. The universities today just seem not to be particularly interested in that. And so our students are coming forward with what Alan Bloom would say are really impoverished souls, I'm sad to say. And it's not their fault. It's the fault of those of us who are supposed to be leading the institutions, who are not standing for this kind of education. I know a lot of conservatives are very upset with the universities, and rightfully so, because they've been over-politicized in one direction. There really isn't a whole lot of diversity of thought in the institutions. There was a great MacDonald-Laurie Institute report that came out that puts numbers beside that now, which show just how bad it is. But what I would suggest for conservatives is, rather than giving up on the university and just turning your back on it, we should be trying to find ways in which we can reinvigorate the true mission of the university. Because if we allow that institution to just continue to drift into the hands of people who we think are antagonistic to the order that we would like to see, the constitutional order, well, universities continue to be, for better or for worse, very powerful institutions. They do shape the ideas and the minds of people who are likely to go on to leadership positions. If we don't like the leaders we've been getting lately, we probably want to try to figure out how to rebalance the university. Not take it over and turn it 100% in the other direction, but simply the conservatives, I think, need to make a concerted, real effort to try to push the pendulum back towards the center. And if you don't do it with the universities, I think you're lost, because you're always going to be fighting a rearguard battle. I think Thomas Hobbes pointed this out in the Leviathan, in the second half of the Leviathan, when all the parts that nobody reads because they only read the first part. The second part, he said, how am I going to make my ideas work? How am I going to change society? Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll take over the universities. Why? Because the universities train the teachers. They train the priests. They train the lawyers. If you can train those people, then you will influence the rest of society. So take over the university if you want to change your society. So if conservatives have no interest in the direction the universities are going in, if they just want to let them drift, you're not going to be happy with the society you're living in.
Yeah,
we need the great books.
Yeah, brilliant. That was just a brilliant soliloquy. Wow. Thank you so much, David. This has been fantastic. We've gone over an hour. I promised we'd only be 50 minutes, and we had such a good discussion. If those of you watching or listening have made it this far, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, leave a comment, tell your friends to subscribe. This is the only way we can save liberal institutions or classical liberal thought, but also deep conservative thinking. So thanks again, David. It was really great having you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Okay.